December 16, 1944. 5:30 a.m. The frozen earth of the Ardennes forest explodes. 2,000 German artillery guns open fire simultaneously. The ground shakes so violently that sleeping American soldiers are thrown from their foxholes into the snow. Shells scream through the pre-dawn darkness, slamming into trees, into men, into everything. Private James Kowalski, a 19-year-old welder from Cleveland, Ohio, is already awake. He has not slept in 36 hours. His feet stopped feeling like his own feet 2 days ago. He presses himself against the frozen dirt wall of his foxhole and listens to the world end around him. He does not know that 3 miles away, in a warm French chateau, with fireplaces roaring and wine flowing, 12 American officers are eating roasted meat off porcelain plates and laughing at something somebody said. He does not know this yet. But General George S. Patton is about to find out. And when he does, what happens next will become the most legendary act of military justice in the entire history of World War II. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. This community is built for people who want the truth behind the myths. Before James Kowalski lost his toes, before Patton walked through that chateau door, you need to understand exactly how bad things were. Not the sanitized version, the real version. December 1944 was not just cold. It was catastrophically cold. Temperatures in the Ardennes dropped to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Sometimes lower. Wind chill pushed that number into ranges where exposed skin begins to die within minutes. The American Army had not prepared for this. Supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. Proper winter boots had not arrived. Thermal gear was a rumor. Anti-freeze for vehicles was rationed so tightly that some units had none at all, meaning their jeeps and half-tracks simply stopped working in the night and would not start again until noon if the sun came out, which it rarely did. The Battle of the Bulge had just detonated across Allied lines. Hitler's last desperate gamble. The Germans called it Operation Watch on the Rhine. The Americans called it a catastrophe. In the first 48 hours, entire battalions were overrun, captured, or destroyed. The 106th Infantry Division lost nearly 7,000 men in 2 days. American soldiers were surrendering in groups of hundreds because there was nowhere to run and no way to fight back against the armored columns punching through the forest. The largest surrender of American troops since the Civil War happened during this battle. The pressure on every surviving unit was absolute. The men who were not captured were dug into the frozen ground, holding lines that should have already collapsed. They could not light fires. Every officer had hammered this point home during briefings. Light a fire, produce smoke, and German artillery observers would zero in on your position within minutes. You would be dead before the wood finished burning. So the soldiers sat in their holes in the darkness and the cold, eating sea rations that had frozen solid inside the cans, wrapping their feet in whatever extra cloth they could find, watching frostbite spread across their hands and faces like a slow invasion of their own bodies. Medics were performing field amputations by the dozen. Toes, fingers, entire feet in advanced cases. Men were being medevaced not from bullet wounds but from temperatures. The cold was killing them as efficiently as the Germans. And the officers who were supposed to be leading these men, supposed to be suffering alongside them, supposed to be setting the standard of endurance that every soldier looks to when things fall apart. Some of those officers had found a different solution entirely. Nobody talks about this part. Nobody publishes it in the official histories. But it happened, and it was real, and it was about to meet the one general in the entire United States Army who absolutely would not tolerate it. His name needed no introduction in December 1944. General George Smith Patton, Jr. was already a legend, and he knew it, and he used it like a weapon. He was 59 years old. He had been fighting wars in one form or another since 1916. He had commanded the 1st American Tank Brigade in World War I. He had driven across North Africa and Sicily like a force of nature. He had slapped a hospitalized soldier in a fit of rage and nearly ended his own career. He had been resurrected from professional exile to command the Third Army, and the Third Army had moved faster and farther than any armored force in the history of warfare. 300 miles in 3 months. Towns liberated, Germans destroyed. Momentum that seemed physically impossible maintained through sheer force of his personality. Patton was not a comfortable man to be around. He wore 2 ivory-handled revolvers on his hips. He wore a helmet that gleamed like a mirror. He wore a leather jacket with 4 stars that he wanted every man who saw him to count. He believed in presence. He believed in visibility. He believed that a general who sat in a command post far from the fighting was not a general. He was a bureaucrat with a title. He made surprise inspections constantly. He would show up unannounced at any position, any time of day or night, and if things were not exactly as they should be, the consequences were immediate and public, and designed to be remembered by every person who witnessed them. December 18th, 1944. 2 days after the German offensive began. Patton's jeep was running through the Belgian countryside in the late evening hours. He was visiting units, checking defensive positions, making certain that the men who were holding the line against the German armor knew that their commanding general was present and watching. His driver, a young sergeant named Mims, who had driven Patton across 3 countries and knew better than to question sudden orders, took a wrong turn somewhere on a map that hadn't been updated since the advance began. They were on a small road, unnamed, cutting through a section of bare winter forest. Patton was about to order Mims to turn around when he saw it. Smoke. Not the thin gray smoke of a dying fire, or the black smoke of something burning that shouldn't be. Multiple columns of steady white wood smoke rising from behind a tree line maybe half a mile ahead, clearly coming from multiple chimneys that were being fed continuously. In a war zone. In December. In an area where every American unit had been told explicitly that fires were forbidden because fires meant smoke and smoke meant death. Patton said 2 words. Drive forward. The road curved through the trees and the chateau appeared like something from a painting. 3 stories of 18th century stone massive windows lit from inside with warm golden light smoke rising from at least 4 separate chimneys. No visible shell damage. No military vehicles out front. No sentries at the gate. The sound of jazz music, actual American jazz, played on a phonograph drifting through the cold night air and landing on Patton's ears like a slap across the face. He got out of the jeep without saying anything. He walked to the front door. It wasn't locked. He pushed it open. The entrance hall hit him first with warmth. Actual warmth. The kind of warmth that his men in their frozen foxholes 3 miles away had not felt in weeks. Crystal chandelier overhead, marble floor beneath his boots, the sound of laughter coming from a doorway to his left. He walked toward it. His footsteps echoed. Nobody heard him coming. 12 officers sat around a dining table that could have seated 30. American officers in clean uniforms, freshly shaved, comfortable. The table was covered with food. Real food. Roasted meat on a platter. Fresh bread. A bowl of vegetables. Wine bottles. Several of them already empty, several more waiting. China plates. Silver flatware. Crystal glasses. One colonel was smoking a cigar. Another was refilling his wine glass. Someone had just said something funny, and the laughter was still dying down when one officer looked up and saw the 4 stars on the leather jacket standing in the doorway. The room went silent. Completely, instantly, catastrophically silent. Forks stopped moving. Glasses stopped in midair. The colonel with the cigar stopped smoking it. Every face in the room turned toward the doorway and registered the same emotion in sequence. Recognition. Understanding. Terror. Patton did not move. He stood in the doorway and looked at them. He looked at the food and the wine and the fire and the comfortable chairs and the warm air and the clean uniforms and the relaxed faces that were no longer relaxed. He looked at all of it for a long time without speaking. The silence stretched so long it became its own form of punishment. The senior officer, a colonel, stood up. He started to explain. He used the word headquarters. He used the word coordination. He used the word necessary. Patton raised one hand and the colonel stopped speaking, as if the hand had physically reached across the room and covered his mouth. Patton walked into the room slowly. He moved along the table, looking at the plates, at the wine, at the faces. He stopped and picked up a piece of bread, examined it, put it back down. Then he looked at the colonel. His voice, when it came, was completely quiet. That was the thing about Patton that everyone who served under him remembered. He did not need to shout to be terrifying. The quiet voice was worse. "Where are your men tonight, Colonel?" The colonel answered, "Foxholes, defensive positions." Patton told him what he had seen that evening during his inspection. A private 19 years old from Iowa. Feet frozen inside his boots. Medic trying to cut the leather away without taking the skin with it. 3 toes already black. The boy was going to walk with a limp for the rest of his life. Patton had spoken to him. The boy had asked through his pain whether the line was going to hold. He was worried about the line. He was lying in the snow with his feet destroyed, and he was worried about the line. Patton looked around the table and made eye contact with each officer individually. He told them that their men knew. Enlisted soldiers always know where their officers sleep, where they eat, what they do when the fighting pauses. They talk. The information moves through a unit faster than any official communication. Every man in the foxholes knew about this chateau. Every man who was losing fingers and toes in the dark knew that his officers were warm. And then Patton gave the order that would be retold for the next 80 years. 10 minutes. Personal combat gear only. You will march to the front line. You will find your units. You will dig a foxhole next to your men, and you will remain there until I personally relieve you. One officer mentioned the time. 3 in the morning. 5 miles. Sub-zero temperatures. Patton told him that his men had done exactly that march the previous day in combat, carrying 60 pounds of gear after already marching 40 miles. The officers would manage. They moved. All 12 of them scrambling for coats and combat packs. The comfortable dinner party becoming a panicked evacuation in under a minute. And before the colonel reached the door, Patton stopped him with one final instruction. This building would become a field hospital. Medical trucks would arrive the following morning. The dining room would be an operating theater. The bedrooms would be recovery wards. The soldiers losing their extremities to frostbite would sleep in the silk sheets. The colonel nodded. He did not speak. He marched out into the freezing night with the others. Patton walked through the empty chateau alone after they left. Room by room. Fireplace still burning in every one. Beds made with clean linens. Personal items scattered on nightstands and chairs. A portable bathtub in one room. A stack of American records next to a phonograph. In the kitchen, enough food to feed a company for a week, while 3 miles away, men were choking down frozen rations and wondering if they were going to survive the night. He ordered everything inventoried before he left. The food would go to the front line. The wine would be destroyed. The building would receive its wounded by morning. And then he wrote a message that went to every battalion commander in the Third Army before dawn. The language was short. The meaning was absolute. Any officer found living in comfort while his men suffered would be relieved of command immediately. Rank is not a privilege. It is a burden. If you cannot carry that burden, I will find someone who can. By the following evening, officers across the entire Third Army were moving toward the front, not for visits, to stay, to dig foxholes, to eat cold rations, to sit in the dark and the freeze alongside the men they commanded. And something happened that no military textbook had predicted, and every soldier understood immediately. The men fought harder. Not because the conditions improved. The conditions were identical, still freezing, still brutal, still men losing pieces of themselves to the cold every single night. But now their officers were in the holes with them. Suffering the same suffering. And a soldier who sees his commander endure what he endures will follow that commander through things he would never survive alone. In Part 2, we follow what happened when the Third Army, transformed overnight by this single act of leadership, faced the most critical moment of the entire Battle of the Bulge. The surrounded paratroopers at Bastogne, are about to run out of ammunition, out of food, out of time. And Patton is going to attempt something that every military strategist said was impossible. A full armored pivot 90 degrees in 3 days in a blizzard to break through German lines before 20,000 men are annihilated. His generals told him it couldn't be done. History was watching. And Private James Kowalski, still alive, still fighting, still freezing in his foxhole, was about to witness the most audacious armored relief operation of World War II. In Part 1, General George Patton made a wrong turn down a country road in Belgium and discovered something that would have ended lesser men's careers just for witnessing it. 12 American officers, warm and comfortable in a French chateau, eating hot meals off china plates, while their soldiers froze to death 5 miles away. Patton gave them 10 minutes to grab their combat packs and march back to the front. He turned the chateau into a field hospital. He sent a message to every battalion commander in the Third Army before dawn. The message was simple, and it changed everything. But here is what that message could not change. The Battle of the Bulge was still exploding across Allied lines. The Germans were still advancing, and 20,000 American paratroopers at a small Belgian crossroads town called Bastogne were completely surrounded, running out of ammunition, running out of food, and running out of time. The question was no longer about officer discipline. The question was whether Patton could do something that every military strategist in Europe said was physically impossible. And this is where things got much worse before they got better. Bastogne sat at the center of 7 major roads through the Ardennes. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement through the entire region. The Germans knew this. 5 divisions of German armor had encircled the town by December 20th. Inside the perimeter, the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, were holding on with sheer stubbornness and almost nothing else. They had no winter clothing. Artillery ammunition was rationed to 10 rounds per gun per day. Medics were operating without morphine. The wounded were stacked in basements with no heat. When the German commander sent a formal demand for surrender, the American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, sent back a single word: nuts. It was the most defiant response in the history of American warfare. It was also a death sentence if nobody came to break through those German lines before the ammunition ran completely dry. Patton walked into the Supreme Allied Command briefing on December 19th and told Eisenhower he could have 3 divisions attacking toward Bastogne within 48 hours. The room went quiet in a way that felt identical to the chateau silence 2 nights earlier. General Omar Bradley turned and looked at him. General Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, set down his pencil. These were experienced men. They had planned invasions, coordinated multinational forces, managed logistics across an entire continent. They knew what Patton was proposing, and they knew what it required: a full army pivot. Third Army was currently oriented facing east, engaged along a broad front. Patton was proposing to swing 3 divisions, 90 degrees, redirect them north, move them through roads clogged with retreating units and civilian refugees in snow and ice at night, through terrain that limited armor movement to specific corridors that the Germans already had covered. All of this in 48 hours. Bradley looked at him across the table. "George, that's not a plan. That's a prayer." Patton looked back. "Then find me a chaplain who can fight, and I'll take both." Eisenhower studied him for a long moment. He asked if Patton actually had the orders drafted. Patton said his staff had been working on the contingency plans since December 17th, 2 days before anyone in this room had asked for them. He had not waited for permission to prepare. He had anticipated the crisis and planned for it, because that was what commanders were supposed to do. Eisenhower gave him the authorization. 48 hours, 3 divisions. Break through to Bastogne, or the 101st Airborne would be annihilated. What happened in the next 2 days was not a military operation. It was an act of collective will applied to the physical world until the physical world agreed to cooperate. 4th Armored Division, 26th Infantry Division, 88th Infantry Division. All of them turning, reorganizing, loading, moving in darkness and sub-zero temperatures across roads that military engineers were still trying to clear of ice and abandoned vehicles. Truck drivers worked 20-hour shifts. Supply sergeants improvised solutions to problems that had no official solutions. Officers who 2 days earlier had received Patton's message about rank being a burden were now visibly, publicly, undeniably carrying that burden alongside every enlisted man in their units. The cultural shift Patton had forced on the chateau night was paying its first dividend before the week was out, but the Germans were not waiting. Between the 3rd Army and Bastogne sat the 5th Parachute Division and elements of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, dug into terrain that funneled any approaching force into narrow kill zones. The first attacks on December 22nd were stopped cold. Literally. Ice on the roads prevented tanks from maintaining formation. Infantry advancing without armor support were cut down by machine gun positions in the tree lines. The 4th Armored lost 14 tanks in 6 hours on December 22nd alone. The perimeter at Bastogne was getting smaller. The ammunition inside was getting lower. General Hugh Gaffey, commanding the 4th Armored, called Patton directly. He described the defensive positions, the terrain, the losses. He said the direct approach was not working and requested permission to wait for better conditions. Patton's response was quiet and immediate. "There are no better conditions coming. There is only what we do right now." He paused. "Find me a way through or find me a commander who can." Gaffey found a way through. Combat Command Reserve led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams identified a corridor near the village of Assenois that German defensive planning had treated as impassable for armor because the ground was soft. In December, that ground was frozen solid. Abrams requested permission to attempt a penetration through the corridor with a combined arms team armor and infantry moving together at maximum speed, bypassing the established defensive positions rather than fighting through them. It was exactly the kind of improvised terrain-exploiting aggression that Patton had been demanding from every officer in the 3rd Army since the Chateau night. December 26th, 15:45 hours. Abrams led his column forward personally. 30 Shermans and a battalion of armored infantry moving fast, moving hard, accepting casualties and continuing forward because stopping meant dying, and moving meant possibly reaching Bastogne before dark. German artillery hit the column 3 times during the advance. They kept moving. Infantry dismounted to clear positions that threatened to stop the tanks. The tanks provided fire to allow the infantry to move. It was combined arms, warfare executed under fire at speed by men who had been awake for 30 hours and were running on cold rations, and the understanding that 20,000 surrounded Americans were waiting for them. At 16:45 hours, the lead Sherman broke through the German perimeter south of Bastogne. The crew of that tank looked out through their vision blocks and saw American paratroopers running toward them through the snow. Inside, Bastogne soldiers who had been holding for 6 days with no resupply, no air support, no reinforcement, heard the sound of American tank engines and understood that they were not going to die today. The corridor was only a few hundred yards wide. German forces immediately began trying to close it. But it was open, and within hours, supply trucks were moving through it, ammunition and food going in, wounded coming out. The siege of Bastogne was broken. The largest encirclement of American forces since the Civil War had been prevented by a general who turned an entire army 90 degrees in 48 hours because he had already been planning for the crisis before anyone authorized him to. But breaking the encirclement was not ending the battle. The German forces surrounding Bastogne did not dissolve. They reorganized. They brought up reinforcements. They attempted to close the corridor multiple times over the following days. The fighting around Bastogne continued at brutal intensity through January. And now a new problem was emerging, one that had nothing to do with German armor or winter terrain. Reports were reaching Patton's headquarters that several of his officer corps, not the Chateau, 12 different officers had begun rotating themselves out of forward positions using administrative justifications. Medical appointments, coordination meetings, supply inspections, all technically legitimate, all functionally identical to what the chateau officers had been doing. The culture was trying to revert, and something else was happening that was more dangerous still. An intelligence report crossed Patton's desk on the evening of December 27th. German military intelligence had somehow obtained detailed information about the Bastogne relief operation timeline, including which units were involved and which corridor had been identified for the breakthrough. The information was too specific to be coincidental. Somewhere inside the Third Army, something was wrong. In Part 3, we follow the investigation that Patton launched in secret while simultaneously managing the most intense, sustained armored offensive of the entire Western Front. The leak will lead somewhere nobody expected, and when Patton finds out where the consequences will make the chateau night look like a polite conversation. In Part 1, Patton discovered 12 officers living like French nobility while their men froze in foxholes and sent them marching back to the front at 3 in the morning. In Part 2, he turned an entire army 90 degrees in 48 hours and broke through to 20,000 surrounded paratroopers at Bastogne when every military strategist said it was impossible. The corridor was open. The siege was broken. But an intelligence report landed on Patton's desk on December 27th that changed everything. German military intelligence had obtained specific details about the Bastogne relief operation, the timeline, the units, the exact corridor Abrams used for the breakthrough, information that precise does not travel by accident. Something inside the Third Army was compromised. And while Patton was hunting the source of that leak, the Germans were doing something far more dangerous than gathering intelligence. They were adapting, they were learning, they were hitting back harder than anyone anticipated. The battle everyone thought was turning was about to get catastrophically worse. Field Marshal Walter Model received the after-action reports from Bastogne on December 27th and immediately called an emergency meeting of his Army Group B commanders. The numbers in those reports were not acceptable. German forces had failed to close a relief corridor held open by a column of 30 American tanks and 1 infantry battalion. A breakthrough that should have been sealed within hours had instead become a permanent supply line feeding the Bastogne perimeter. Model was a precise, methodical commander, one of Hitler's favorites, precisely because he did not panic and he did not make excuses. He looked at the reports, identified the problem with surgical clarity, and issued new orders before the meeting ended. The 9th SS Panzer Division was redirected toward the Bastogne corridor. Artillery from 3 separate German units was repositioned to interdict the supply route. Luftwaffe ground attack aircraft, still operational, despite Allied air superiority, were assigned to hit the corridor during the narrow windows of bad weather that grounded American fighters. The Germans were not retreating from Bastogne. They were tightening the ring around the corridor itself, attempting to strangle the relief line even if they could no longer close the original encirclement. Between December 28th and January 3rd, the corridor was attacked 11 times. American casualties holding it open totaled 1,200 men in 6 days. 3 times German armor came close enough to the road that supply trucks had to be halted while tank battles were fought within 400 yards of the route. The 4th Armored Division, which had broken through on December 26th, was now fighting continuously to keep open what it had opened, losing men and equipment at a rate that could not be sustained indefinitely. German losses during these attacks were severe, but Model had more divisions available than Patton did, and he was willing to spend them. The intelligence leak investigation was running simultaneously handled by Patton's G2 intelligence section under conditions of extreme secrecy. They identified the source within 4 days. It was not a spy. It was not a traitor. It was an administrative failure so mundane it was almost insulting. A liaison officer had been transmitting operational summaries over a radio frequency that had been compromised without anyone being informed. The Germans had been reading Third Army operational summaries for 11 days. The frequency was changed immediately. The officer was reassigned. The damage was already done, but at least it was finite. Patton read the report, wrote 1 line of response in the margin, and moved on. There was no time for anything else, because the internal situation inside the Third Army was developing its own separate crisis that threatened everything he had built since the chateau night. 3 battalion commanders had submitted medical evacuation requests within 48 hours of each other, all citing combat fatigue, all originating from units that were currently engaged in the corridor defense. Medical officers who reviewed the requests found them technically legitimate and medically defensible. They were also in the judgment of every senior officer who looked at them a coordinated attempt to rotate out of the most dangerous assignment in the entire Third Army during the most critical period of the battle. Patton's chief of staff brought him the paperwork and waited for a response. Patton approved the evacuations. All 3. He wrote his own addendum to each file. The addendum stated that each officer was being medically evacuated and would be reassigned upon recovery to administrative positions in the rear area, where the demands of combat leadership would not interfere with their health. He then personally called the regimental commanders of all 3 battalions and promoted the senior captains to acting battalion command on the spot. He told each newly promoted officer the same thing. You have 4 hours before your first attack. Use them wisely. But here is what the paperwork did not show, and what the internal crisis concealed. Something was breaking right underneath the surface of the entire operation, and it had nothing to do with German armor or compromised frequencies or officers rotating out of the line. The sustained tempo Patton had imposed on the Third Army since December 19th was pushing men and equipment past designed operational limits. Tank engines that had been running continuously for 12 days were failing. Fuel consumption was running 30% above planned rates because vehicles were operating in temperatures that degraded efficiency dramatically. Artillery ammunition resupply was falling behind consumption, and the soldiers who had been fighting, marching, and surviving in sub-zero temperatures for 3 weeks were beginning to show the cumulative effects of sustained cold exposure at a scale that the medical system could not absorb. Patton stood in his command post on January 2nd and looked at the logistics reports spread across the map table. He had 3 days of ammunition at current consumption rates, fuel for approximately 5 days of operations, a medical evacuation backlog of 3,400 men waiting for transport. He looked at his chief of staff and said something that nobody outside that room heard for 20 years. We are going to win this in the next 72 hours. Or we are going to have a very serious problem. Then he picked up the phone and called his division commanders. January 3rd, 1945, 0600 hours. Temperature 8 degrees Fahrenheit. The village of Lutrebois, Belgium. The 6th Armored Division, newly committed to the Bastogne sector, received orders to take Lutrebois, a German-held position that anchored the right flank of the corridor defense and was the primary staging point for German counterattacks against the supply route. Taking Lutrebois would not end the Battle of the Bulge. It would not even end the fighting around Bastogne, but it would remove the single most dangerous threat to the corridor and buy the time needed for the logistics situation to stabilize. Combat Command. A launched at dawn. 38 Sherman tanks, 2 infantry battalions, a battery of tank destroyers, and a company of combat engineers. The ground was frozen hard enough to support armor in most areas, but soft enough in the low ground to immobilize anything that left the road. The German defenders knew this. They had positioned their anti-tank guns on the high ground, flanking both sides of the approach route, creating interlocking fields of fire that covered every avenue of advance. The first wave hit the German line at 0645, 3 Shermans destroyed in 4 minutes. Infantry moving alongside the tanks took immediate fire from the tree line on the left flank. The advance stopped. The battalion commander, a newly promoted captain named Walter Gent from Cincinnati, called back for artillery support and was told the battery was already engaged supporting a secondary attack 2 miles north. He had what he had to make it work. Gent dismounted from his command vehicle, walked forward on foot to the lead tank, found the tank commander, a sergeant named Ellis, and looked at the ground between their position and the German guns on the high ground. The low ground between them was frozen. It had been frozen for 19 days. But there was a creek bed cutting across the approach that nobody had mapped because it was buried under 3 feet of snow. If the creek bed was frozen solid, it was a path around the left flank of the German position, invisible from the high ground, narrow enough that vehicles would have to move in single file, but accessible. Ghent sent 2 infantrymen to test the ice. They reported it was solid. He ordered the column to follow the creek bed. 12 tanks. 1 file. Moving through a frozen creek bed that the German defenders did not know existed. The engineers went first, checking ice thickness every 50 meters. The infantry moved on both banks, keeping low, keeping quiet, moving as fast as men can move through knee-deep snow without making a sound that carries across frozen ground to listening posts. They emerged from the creek bed 200 yards behind the right flank of the German anti-tank position at 0823 hours. The German gun crews never heard them coming. 12 Shermans opened fire simultaneously at a range of less than 300 yards. The position was destroyed in under 4 minutes. 6 anti-tank guns. 18 German soldiers killed. 12 captured. The remaining defenders in Lutrebois suddenly flanked and, with their primary anti-tank defense gone, began withdrawing north toward Ardennes. Combat Command A entered Lutrebois at 0947 hours. The village was secured by 1100. German counterattack at 1340 hours was repelled with the loss of 4 more Shermans and approximately 340 German soldiers killed or captured in a single engagement that lasted less than 2 hours. By nightfall, the right flank of the corridor was stable for the first time since December 26. Supply trucks moved through without interruption for the first time in 9 days. Captain Ghent was promoted to major by direct order that evening. He was 26 years old. He was also the 4th officer in the 3rd Army to receive a battlefield promotion during the Bastogne operation, all of them men who had been in forward positions, all of them men who knew exactly where their soldiers were and what they were enduring because they were enduring it alongside them. The Battle of Lutrebois was a small engagement by the standards of World War II. It would not appear in most histories of the Battle of the Bulge. But inside the 3rd Army, it spread with the speed of something that people needed to believe in. A young captain with no tanks to spare and no artillery available had found a frozen creek bed in a snowstorm and used it to destroy a German defensive position that had stopped a full armored column. He had done it because he was on the ground, because he was forward, because he was exactly where Patton had demanded every officer be since the night of the chateau. By January 8th, German forces around Bastogne had lost an estimated 12,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured, since the relief corridor opened. 41 tanks and assault guns destroyed. The offensive capability of the forces surrounding the town was effectively broken. Model requested permission to begin a phased withdrawal on January 9th. Hitler refused. Model began withdrawing anyway 3 days later, accepting the consequences because the alternative was the destruction of forces he no longer had the replacements to rebuild. The 3rd Army had covered 150 miles of front during the Battle of the Bulge, committed 18 divisions, and inflicted casualties at a ratio that American planners had not projected as achievable in winter terrain against prepared defenses. 3rd Army casualties during the period were severe. The German losses were catastrophic. The culture that had been forced into existence by a wrong turn down a country road and 12 officers eating off china plates had produced over 17 days of sustained combat, something that could not be manufactured by any other method. An army where officers led from the front because they had been given no other option, and where soldiers followed because they had seen their officers choose the foxhole over the chateau. Patton received a message from Eisenhower on January 10th, acknowledging the Bastogne operation. He read it, filed it, and went back to his maps. There was still a war to win, and he was already planning the next phase of operations. But what nobody talks about, what the official histories skip past in their rush toward the Rhine crossing and the final collapse of Germany, is what happened to Patton himself in the weeks that followed. What the sustained pressure of command had cost him, and what he did with a French chateau in the spring of 1945 that would become the last chapter of a story that began with a wrong turn and a roaring fireplace, and 12 men who had forgotten what they were there for. In Part 4, we follow the final act. The war ends. The armies go home. And the men who were in those foxholes spend the rest of their lives trying to explain to people who were not there what it actually meant to serve under a commander who demanded that rank be a burden and not a privilege. That story. The quiet one. The one that lives in memoirs and letters home and conversations that happened in kitchens decades after the shooting stopped, is the one that changes how you understand everything that came before. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Germany signed unconditional surrender documents in a schoolhouse in Reims, France, and the shooting stopped. Soldiers who had been living in foxholes and half-tracks and frozen fields for months suddenly had nothing to do except exist, which turned out to be harder than anyone expected. The transition from combat to silence is not a gentle one. Men who had operated on adrenaline and fear and the absolute clarity of survival found themselves sitting in requisitioned buildings with no enemy to fight and no objective to take and no reason to get out of bed before noon. The great machine of the Third Army, which had moved faster and farther than any armored force in the history of warfare, simply stopped. And George Patton, who had been in motion since 1942, found himself in Bavaria with nothing left to conquer and no idea what to do about it. He was given the military governorship of Bavaria. It was supposed to be an honor. It felt like a sentence. Patton was a combat commander. He understood attack and defense and logistics and the management of men under fire. He did not understand denazification policy or civilian administration, or the political calculations that occupied every conversation in the post-war occupation. He made statements that alarmed his superiors. He expressed opinions that contradicted official Allied policy with the same bluntness he had used to send 12 officers marching into a Belgian winter at 3 a.m. Eisenhower relieved him of the Bavaria command in October 1945. Patton accepted the decision without public complaint, which was itself remarkable for a man who had never accepted anything quietly in his professional life. He died on December 21, 1945, 13 days after a traffic accident outside Mannheim, Germany. His neck broke in the collision. He was 60 years old. He had survived 3 wars, 2 world wars, and the punitive expedition into Mexico, multiple airplane incidents, a political assassination attempt on his career, and some of the most intense armored combat in human history. He died in a hospital bed from injuries sustained when his staff car was hit by an army truck at low speed on a road he had traveled dozens of times before. The men who had served under him received the news in the same way soldiers always receive the news of a commander's death: quietly, without adequate words, with the particular grief of people who understood exactly what had been lost and could not explain it to anyone who had not been there. James Kowalski, the 19-year-old welder from Cleveland, who had been introduced in the frozen foxholes of the Ardennes in December 1944, came home to Ohio in the summer of 1945 with 3 toes missing from his left foot and a Purple Heart he kept in a shoebox in his closet for 40 years. He went back to welding. He married a woman named Ruth. He had 4 children. He coached Little League for 11 seasons. He never spoke about the war at family dinners. His children grew up knowing their father had served and had been wounded, and that was approximately the extent of their knowledge. In 1987, his youngest son found the shoebox, asked his father about it. Kowalski sat at the kitchen table for a long moment before he answered. What he said was not about the cold, though the cold had been extraordinary. It was not about the Germans, though the Germans had been lethal and professional and had fought with the desperate energy of men who understood that defeat meant the end of everything they had built. What Kowalski talked about for the first time in 42 years was the morning after the chateau night. He had been in his foxhole when his company commander appeared before dawn on foot carrying a combat pack and dug himself into the ground 12 feet away. The captain did not announce himself, did not call the men together for a speech, did not explain where he had come from or why he was suddenly present in a forward position he had not occupied in 2 weeks. He simply dug a hole and got in it, and was there when the artillery started at first light, and was still there when it stopped, and ate the same frozen rations as everyone else when midday came without any improvement in the situation. Kowalski told his son that he had not known about the chateau until weeks later when the story spread through the army the way all important information eventually spreads through conversation, through soldiers talking to other soldiers in the spaces between engagements. When he finally understood why his captain had appeared in that foxhole before dawn, he felt something he struggled to name even 40 years afterward. It was not gratitude exactly. It was closer to the recognition that someone had understood what was required and done it without being asked, which is a rarer quality in human beings than any list of military decorations can capture. The colonel who had been hosting the chateau dinner, the senior officer who had tried to explain the situation to Patton and been silenced by a raised hand, survived the war. He served through the Rhine crossing and the final advance into Germany. He was present at the German surrender. He retired from the army in 1952 as a brigadier general. In 1963, he contributed a chapter to a privately circulated collection of officer memoirs that was never commercially published. The chapter was titled simply December 1944, and it contained the most honest account of the chateau incident that any participant ever committed to paper. He wrote that he had known in the moment Patton appeared in the doorway that everything he had been telling himself about the necessity of officer comfort was wrong. Not slightly wrong. Completely structurally, fundamentally wrong. He had constructed a justification for his own comfort that sounded reasonable in the telling, and was indefensible in the presence of a general who had spent that same evening visiting men whose feet were freezing inside their boots. The justification did not survive contact with reality. Most justifications don't, he wrote, which is why it is important to stay close enough to reality to be unable to avoid it. He wrote that the march back to the front that night, 5 miles in sub-zero temperatures at 3 in the morning, carrying a combat pack, was the most useful thing he had done in 6 months of command. Not because it was punishing, though it was, because it was clarifying. Every step of that march removed another layer of the comfortable fiction he had been living inside, and by the time he reached his unit's position and began digging a foxhole in frozen ground with hands that had gone numb 30 minutes earlier, he understood something about leadership that he had apparently never understood before, despite 20 years of military service. You cannot lead people through something you are not willing to experience yourself. The rank does not grant you the authority to exempt yourself from the conditions you impose on others. It grants you the responsibility to be present in those conditions so that your decisions are informed by reality rather than by reports. The chateau itself continued operating as a field hospital through February 1945. Approximately 340 wounded American soldiers were treated there during that period. Some of them were men from the same units whose officers had been eating off china plates in the dining room. The irony of sleeping in those silk-sheeted beds while recovering from combat wounds inflicted during the same battle was not lost on the soldiers who experienced it. Several of them mentioned it in letters home. The letters described the beds, the warm rooms, the food that the medical staff provided during recovery, and then they described knowing that their officers had been removed from those same beds and sent back to the front. The tone of those letters was not angry. It was satisfied in the specific way that soldiers are satisfied when they discover that the rules apply to everyone. Walter Ghent, the 26-year-old captain who found a frozen creek bed outside Loutrebois and used it to destroy a German defensive position that had stopped a full armored column served in Korea, and retired as a colonel in 1962. In interviews conducted by military historians in the 1970s, he consistently traced his willingness to improvise under fire to a single cultural fact about the Third Army during the Battle of the Bulge. He said that he had known with certainty that his battalion commander was in a foxhole somewhere nearby, that his regimental commander was forward, that the culture from top to bottom demanded presence rather than distance, and that this knowledge had freed him to make decisions at his level that would previously have required him to wait for authorization from officers who were not there to see what he was seeing. This is the thing about the chateau night that gets lost in the drama of Patton's entrance and the officers scrambling for their combat packs. The lasting consequence was not disciplinary. It was not even about those 12 specific officers. It was about what happened to an entire army when the standard became presence. When every officer understood that rank was a burden to be carried forward, not a privilege to be enjoyed in the rear. The soldiers who fought under those conditions fought differently than soldiers fight when they believe their leaders are comfortable somewhere behind them. They made better decisions. They improvised more effectively. They held positions they had no rational reason to hold because the person asking them to hold it was holding it alongside them. Patton understood this not as a theory, but as a practical combat multiplier. An army where officers lead from the front is a different instrument than an army where they do not. Not marginally different. Fundamentally different. The Battle of the Bulge did not end the war. The Third Army's performance during those weeks did not single-handedly determine the outcome. But the margin by which Bastogne was held, by which the German offensive was broken, by which 20,000 surrounded paratroopers survived to fight again, was produced by something that began with a wrong turn down a country road and a general who walked through an unlocked door and found 12 men who had forgotten what they were there for. Private James Kowalski walked with a limp for the rest of his life. He lived to be 81 years old. At his funeral in 2006, his youngest son spoke about the shoebox and the conversation at the kitchen table in 1987. He said his father had told him one thing about leadership that he had carried ever since. His father had said that the only leaders worth following are the ones who show up in the same weather they send you into. Everything else, the rank, the title, the authority, is just paperwork. The weather is the truth.